Tonight, a First Tuesday special. Good evening and welcome to a specially extended programme for April, because tonight we mark an anniversary. 5 years ago, Argentina invaded the Falkland Islands and Britain became involved in a war which killed 1,000 people and injured over 2,000 others. There's a story behind those figures which goes well beyond the winning and the losing. The reality of war is something that only those immediately affected can truly describe. Tonight, for the first time on television, the fighting men on both sides relive that battle for the Falklands, as do the islanders, the families at home in Britain and Argentina, and those taking the military and political decisions. You will hear of events that have never been revealed before. You'll see war footage that has never been shown before. Here, 5 years on, is the Falklands War, the untold story.
This is Stanley, the Falklands broadcasting station. Been instructed by the government of the Falkland Islands to call you and ask you to repeat the message.
For the purpose of avoiding bloodshed and property damage among the population, we hope that you shall act prudently. Our concern is for the welfare and safety of the people of the Malvinas. This was the message from the Argentine Armed Forces.
4 a.m., April the 2nd, 1982. Argentine Navy cameramen film their invasion of the Falkland Islands. Frogmen landed first from a submarine, followed later by the main assault force. It was an historic day for Argentina.
Por supuesto, como argentino me sentí muy emocionado y también como...
I was thrilled. As an Argentine and as a professional soldier, I was thrilled to be taking part in the recovery of these islands that had been in British hands for so long. It made me very proud.
Me llenó de orgullo.
This is the Falkland Islands broadcasting studio. Now, we've just had a call from Alistair Grieve. Alistair, I understand that you've sighted some of the vehicles, have you?
I had a quick look out through the curtains and all I could see was smoke, so I honestly haven't a clue what's happening. But there's been some really heavy bangs, the whole place is shaking. It's a bit nerve-wracking to say the least. There's a lot of machine gun fire and fairly small arms fire as well.
And where are you giving this report from, Ali? Are you standing up, sitting down, or what are you doing?
I'm lying on the floor, boy.
Now, the situation, as you might hear, is that the radio station has now been taken over. We have 3 Argentine
Wait a minute. We have everything recorded in 2 tapes.
Yes.
Okay? For the population.
Well, just a minute.
Señor, un minuto!
If you take the gun out of my back, I'm going to transmit that news. If you take the gun away. But I'm not speaking with the gun in my back.
Everybody was very, very low in spirits. Obviously, we didn't know whether we were going to be shot or what was going to happen, taken back to Argentina. Everybody knew of the regime over there, the military government, what they'd done to their own people. They knew they wanted the Falklands and our future. Well, we didn't know our future.
By 7 a.m., after fierce fighting, Government House was completely surrounded.
En las inmediaciones de la casa del gobernador, muy próximo,
I captured 2 Royal Marines near Government House. They were waiting there, lying on the ground with all their weapons. I saw another Marine trying to reach Government House. So I covered him with my machine gun and made him come towards me.
Suddenly you're in their hands. I mean, there's 3 casualties of theirs lying in the garden in Government House. I mean, what sort of mood are they going to be in? You know, when their oppos sort of shot up. And so when he actually lying down, I felt a bit humiliated, but I also felt apprehensive about what was going to happen next. But one of the Argentine officers, he came along and he actually struck one of the guards and told us to stand up. And we stood up and he shook my hand and he shook a few of the guys' hands and said that, you know, we shouldn't lie down and we should be proud of what we'd done. I was quite pleased, actually, that we were stopping, you know. I make no bones about it, you know, I didn't fancy sort of, you know, getting shot to bits.
La diferencia fundamental es la falta de motivación que...
The Royal Marines lacked our motivation. I think the reason for our motivation was the cause we were defending. You have to understand, we were defending something that was ours. They were simply following orders as professional soldiers.
En este mapa que vemos acá de la República Argentina, las Malvinas aparecen ubicadas en la zona austral. Toda esa distancia que hay está separada por el mar. Ese mar que es el mar argentino.
The Malvinas are a national cause in Argentina. Pupils in primary school learn about their lost heritage, of how the British stole the islands from them in 1833. Youngsters are shown that the islands are part of Argentina's continental shelf.
La plataforma continental va a ser la prolongación del continente por debajo del agua.
From a South American perspective, Britain's claim to the islands is absurd. Even an unpopular dictatorship would be acclaimed if it could recover the Malvinas. When news of the invasion reached Buenos Aires, the crowds went wild. The military regime's record of violent repression, the economic crisis, all were forgotten overnight. The national dream of reoccupying the Malvinas had been realized.
I can't deny that I was immensely thrilled. It was thrilling to see the huge crowd outside Government House supporting our action regardless of their political beliefs. The workers had demonstrated against the government in that same square only a few days before. But now even the trade unions were there supporting Argentina's stand. So I can't deny that it was one of the most moving moments of my life.
Quizás unos momentos más emocionantes y más importantes de mi vida.
Have you heard from the governor at all this afternoon, sir?
In London, there was outrage that the government had allowed British sovereign territory to be invaded. There were rowdy scenes in Parliament, swiftly followed by resignations.
It is a national humiliation, and I have been responsible for foreign affairs. And I do not think it is right that when that happens, the minister responsible should just go on as if nothing had happened. And I think that the honourable thing to do is to resign.
Britain's prestige was severely damaged. The government turned to the armed forces.
I think everybody thought it would all be over before we got there. You know, there'd be a few little troops on a little island, and when they seen the Royal Navy coming, they'd scurry home. You know, it would be all over.
Thought, why the hell did he want to invade somewhere at the top of Scotland, like? because nobody understood where the Falklands were. I hadn't got a clue.
I've always said years ago, God, if there's ever a war breaks out, I'm swimming back to Belfast where I was born. You know, they're not getting me to war. No, I didn't join for war. I didn't want to go, but I thought, well, I've got to go. You know, the taxpayers have been paying my wages for all these years, and okay, they've called my number for once. They've called all our numbers for once.
As the task force steamed south through the tropics, few of those on board thought they were actually going to war.
In his letters, he was really thrilled. He'd said, the social life is fantastic. You know, we're playing darts and there's loads of people, cards and cribbage games. There's lots of deck games going on. And he said in one of his letters, whatever's waiting for us down there, nothing will look so bad if we've still got this happy atmosphere on board ship.
There was a curious air of unreality on the way to Ascension. None of us really thought it would come to a war at that stage. Every day we listened to the BBC World Service about the diplomatic manoeuvres that were going on, and we genuinely believed there would be a diplomatic settlement, and we were merely an extension of that diplomacy.
We had to learn Spanish. Virtually the only stuff that we did learn was things like Manos Arribas and Rendaze, which means hands up and surrender. We didn't think it was much point in learning sort of I surrender or anything like that.
Many of them had adopted a rather belligerent, gung-ho attitude. One of the helicopter pilots told me that he'd never dropped a real depth charge on a live target, and he was quite looking forward to it now. And one of the Harrier pilots said that what Britain needed was a small war like this. It would do morale no end of good.
The Falklands became an armed camp. In their thousands, young conscripts arrived from Argentina.
La primera vez que ingresé al pueblo, veía que todo lo que había.
The first time I went into Port Stanley, I noticed that everything was English. There was practically nothing there to remind me of Argentina. I remember picking up a little nail and it had Made in England written on it.
Clavito. Y decía Made in England, el clavito. Entonces,
So I started wondering what it all meant. I thought, where am I? What is this? I had been told that we were going to the Malvinas to defend our people. But it turned out that they weren't our people at all. So you had to ask yourself, who were the invaders? Them or us?
Malvinas Operation Theater Command, communique number 4, guarantees the continuity of the way of life of the people of the islands, respect for private property, freedom to enter, leave, or remain on the islands. Furthermore, the population is exhorted to continue normally with their activities.
One of the first things they said when they arrived that nothing would change, and the next things they said was how things had to change. We had to drive on the other side of the road. We had to have passes to go around Stanley. We weren't let out of Stanley. And people, of course, thought back to the Second World War and how it must have felt for the French and the Dutch and the countries, you know, in Europe occupied by the Germans.
Our military presence grew till about 10,000 men surrounded the village, so Port Argentino became almost like a tiny island in a sea of troops. Yet I'm proud to say that throughout our occupation of the Malvinas, there wasn't a single case of rape or attempted rape. There wasn't a single case of assault. There were a few burglaries. Any offenders were court-martialed and sentenced whether they were conscripts, NCOs, or officers.
The house next door was unoccupied. Our neighbours were in UK. We had the key of the house. We realised there were a lot of Argentinians banging on the door, knocking. My husband said, well, rather than let them break the door down, I'll go out and give them the key. He was immediately taken by the Argentinians and made to kneel at our front gate. It was a bitterly cold day, Sunday afternoon. For about 20 minutes, over 20 minutes, he was kneeling there in his shirt sleeves with a submachine gun at his back. I never realised just what it was like when you can't sit down. I tried to sit down and I couldn't. I was so tensed up, I was so worried. All I did really was walk to the kitchen and made a cup of coffee and came back. I didn't know that in 20 minutes, half an hour, one can drink so many cups of coffee. And I put on Land of Hope and Glory and opened the windows, and I felt that, knowing my husband's sense of humour, that if he were to die, that if the last thing he heard was that, at least he would die with perhaps a little smile on his face.
The United States was anxious to avoid a war between two of its closest allies.
The whole conflict seemed to be strange. It seemed to be much less important than it obviously seemed to both sides, because the Falkland Islands by themselves did not seem to be objectively that important, if I may say so, to anyone. And yet suddenly they had become the focus of this enormous, intense conflict.
Alexander Haig desperately sought a negotiated settlement. On board his peace shuttle was David Gompert.
Well, of course, the most memorable recollection one has about London was Mrs. Thatcher herself and the way she presided over the War Cabinet and spoke for Britain in the negotiations. She would allow others to speak, to address particular aspects of it based on their expertise, but in all cases she would have the final word, and in some cases she would explicitly overrule a senior member of her cabinet.
She was never in any doubt. There may have been those of us who at one moment or another thought, should we just give a little bit more? Would it finally end the problems which we hadn't yet faced of actually invading from ships in the South Atlantic? But she was totally resolute.
In London, we did not find a very positive disposition toward negotiation. The view there, quite simply, was foreign troops have occupied land over which Her Majesty's government is responsible, and the issue at hand is the removal of the troops, not the negotiation of the conditions after those troops are gone. And that's about all we received by way of encouragement in London.
The stormy waters of the South Atlantic brought with them a change in the atmosphere on board the ships of the task force. The closer they got to the islands, the greater the need for military preparedness. The Royal Marines who defended the islands in the original Argentine invasion had been deported to Britain by their captors. Now they were returning as part of the task force.
We were a little bit of a celebrity status, you know, with the other Marines. You know, it's sort of, you know, what's it like, you know, being under fire, you know, and what's it like sort of doing this, that and the other, and you're sort of swept along with the whole thing about, you know, well, we're going to go down there and sort of dick these lot, and as we got nearer, the old for Queen and country and all that was going out the window, you know. And it was more of let's get down there, do it, and let's get back, you know. And if we don't have to go down and do it, great.
I was quite convinced we were going to fight. I've got far too much imagination to be brave or gung-ho or anything like that. My company commander, John Kisley, was in many ways of the same opinion as me. I remember once talking to him, and we just had a photograph taken of the whole of the company, which was left flank, and we looked at it afterwards, and he said to me, well, it's rather sad, but some of those faces won't be there if we take a photograph on the way back.
I thought about it for some time, and I decided to write my wife a letter and explain to her how much I loved her, my feelings for her, things that she could remember me by, a piece of music, a place to go. I gave her some advice as to how to behave as a widow, as I remember. And it was difficult for me to write. The more difficult one was to write to my son. And I don't think, even now, I haven't reread it, but it was certainly blotted with tears. Having written them, and it was the hardest thing I've ever done in my life, I then posted them to my father and asked him to pass them on in the event of my death.
Arriving in Buenos Aires, the peace shuttle met a series of setbacks.
It is clear tonight that the task will not be easy, but the stakes are so great that they demand the ultimate effort on the part of all participants in these discussions. Thank you.
The mood on the street was jubilant. The junta promised the Malvinas would never be surrendered. Argentina would never give up its birthright.
There was about their attitude a kind of frivolousness, first of all, as though they were not really serious, as though they did not have a sense of what war would be like. They had no sense of the tragedy of war and of the loss of life. They had no sense that they were going to be defeated. As I pointed out to them, surely they were going to be defeated. They had no experience in war. They would be fighting one of the world's great powers, which Britain is, and they couldn't even treat the matter fully seriously. They couldn't decide among themselves, and it was clear by then that they had decided, in fact, to go ahead, if for no other reason than that they were incapable of uniting in a decision not to go ahead to war.
It was our failure to grasp that agreement, our failure to make it stick in Buenos Aires, that in fact had removed the last hurdle and permitted the forces to engage and the killing to begin.
Se repite el ataque contra Puerto Argentino. Santiago nuestro, Santiago nuestro. Ahí pasó, ahí pasó, ahí pasó.
May the 1st. Britain launches an airstrike against Argentine positions around Port Stanley.
We were woken by a friend saying, they're here, they're here, they're here, the British are here. And I was so elated that I stood in our front window and jumped up and down. And as I turned around, I realised that the Argentinians, the machine gun nest just a few yards away from our house, were pointing the gun at me and indicating that unless I got down, they were going to shoot me. So needless to say, I very quickly got out of the window.
We were probably far more overconfident than we should have been. And I think the general feeling was that, well, we've given the Argentinians a bloody nose. and very soon they'll turn around and say, that's it, we don't want any more, and everything will be over.
Argentina was not defenseless against the task force. It too had a powerful navy which set out to find the British fleet and sink it. There were new warships equipped with modern missiles. But proudest of all was the World War II cruiser USS Phoenix, now renamed after one of Argentina's greatest heroes, General Belgrano.
Serving on the Belgrano was the goal of every professional sailor, because of her tradition and because of what she represented in the Argentine Navy.
The nuclear submarine HMS Conqueror had been patrolling the South Atlantic for a fortnight. It shadowed the Belgrano for 2 days.
And the ship right ahead on that bearing.
294.
At 4 p.m. on the 2nd of May, under direct orders from London, it fired 3 torpedoes at the cruiser. 2 struck home.
Esa primera explosión fue realmente la que causó la mayor cantidad de muertos en el buque.
The first explosion was the cause of the greatest number of deaths on the Belgrano. About 275 sailors died as a result of that explosion and the massive flooding that followed. 4 seconds later came the second torpedo, 15 feet from the bow. Those 15 feet practically disappeared underwater. All the crew members assembled by their life rafts, waiting for the order to abandon ship.
Tomo la decisión de ordenar ese abandono.
I finally decided to give that order, and surely it must be the most painful and tragic order in a naval officer's career.
Debe ser la más importante y la más trágica de toda su historial marinero.
Uno se siente imposibilitado de no poder salvar más gente, sabiendo que hay más gente abajo.
We knew there were more people below decks and there was nothing we could do to rescue them. We would have tried, but it was just impossible. All we could do was try and collect the wounded from the main deck and take them to the life rafts. Most of them had been burned by the explosions and the fires. We knew that we were leaving behind lots of our friends. They were below decks, hoping that we could somehow rescue them. We just couldn't get to them. I couldn't bear it, leaving them behind.
Pero usted sabía que ahí abajo estaban sus colegas,
exacto,
sus amigos.
En otro puesto de guardia.
And there was nothing you could do.
Nada.
Driven by strong winds towards the Antarctic Ocean, the life rafts from the Belgrano drifted in sub-zero temperatures. After 2 days, some were recovered by the hospital ship Valparaiso. Many of the Belgrano sailors had died of exposure. They had literally frozen to death.
Venía sobre el techo de la balsa. Se ve que en un último intento de ser visualizado y de que era una balsa ocupada.
I remember we sighted one life raft, and it had somebody on top of it who seemed to be asleep. He was so well wrapped up that all you could see was his face. He had his survival suit and his life jacket. He was well prepared. At a distance, he seemed to be sleeping peacefully, with his hands folded under his face. He had obviously climbed on top of the life raft looking for rescue ships. When we brought him aboard, we found out that he was dead.
That young officer was Lieutenant Gerardo Sevilla.
Tuve un llamado telefónico de mi hijo mayor. Me dijo, ¿estás escuchando?
That night, my other son called, and he asked me whether I'd been listening to the radio. I said no, I'd been watching the television. He said he'd been listening to some ridiculous stories on a foreign radio station, but he didn't say anything else. So I went to bed, and early the next morning I switched on the radio, and the first thing I hear is that the Belgrano has been attacked.
Que se hundió, bombardearon el crucero General Belgrano.
I rushed to the phone to call my son and my sister, and it turned out that they had been up all night listening to the news. That was the start of my long night. My long nights.
La larga noche, las largas noches. El lunes no aparecía.
The next day, no news. On Tuesday, nothing. That afternoon, the parish priest at the church just across the road from my home said a special mass. All my neighbors and relatives came to pray for my son's safe return. But it was not to be.
No fue así. Desgraciadamente no fue así. Fue muy angustiante.
He was just a boy. He was 6'5".
Chico que medía 1.90.
So happy. So healthy.
Toda su vitalidad, sanísimo.
Oh well. He wouldn't like to see me crying like this.
En fin. Él no quisiera que yo estuviera así en este momento.
Commander speaking. Today we've had a large measure of success. The Belgrano, the Argentinian cruiser, has been torpedoed to the south of the Falkland Islands by one of our SSNs.
Any euphoria following the sinking of an enemy vessel was short-lived. Argentine Navy pilots were determined to hit back. They took off from airfields in southern Argentina, equipped with Exocet missiles, and went in search of revenge. HMS Sheffield was on the lookout for enemy aircraft well forward of the main British fleet.
Blind, AWOL, one probable target, 01010.
Go fast, direct the radar.
The sea was very calm, we were looking out to sea, and I thought that it looked like a torpedo was on its way because the sea was shimmering and shaking, if you like. So I said I thought there was a torpedo. The pilot also had trained his glasses around to the same spot, and he said, no, it's an Exocet. The officer of the watch and other members of the bridge crew started to take cover. But I remember myself and the second officer of the watch becoming transfixed to the missile on its way in, which really does amaze me now when I come to think of it, but we watched it almost to the point of impact when we quickly huddled together and dropped to the floor.
San Carlos, the place chosen for the British landings. The special boat squadron had been watching the area in secret for weeks. They were amazed to find it only lightly defended.
We couldn't possibly defend every single spot where the British forces might have chosen to land. We didn't have enough resources. We had to defend the main target, Porto Argentino.
Of course, the Argentinians are trained by the Americans or influenced by the Americans and believe that we were also. They've therefore thought if they were doing it, they would land in Stanley, and they assumed that because we had American influence, we would land as close to Stanley. We don't do it that way. And quite apart from anything else, it would have caused terrible and totally unforgivable casualties to civilians. And it's just not the British way of doing things. We prefer a rather more subtle approach to these matters.
Subo a su puesto de observatorio, ya se había despejado un poco la bruma y no solamente estaba, ¿no es cierto?
I went up to the observation post, and the mist was lifting. I could clearly see several frigates and transport ships, and there were dozens of helicopters flying about and landing craft coming towards us.
Terreno firme de la isla. Realmente era impactante.
And let me tell you, it was quite a sight. I had never seen such a fleet deployed in front of me. There were 5,000 troops about to land, and there I was with my 40 men.
When we hit the beach, in my particular boat, the ramp went down, and a naval order, which is part of their drills, I suppose, went out as troops out, and not a soul moved in the boat. Because, of course, when you move a paratrooper collectively, you don't shout out, you shout go. And this Royal Marine shouted again, troops out! Nothing happened. And then a quick-witted Sergeant Major shouted, go! And everybody flooded off the boat.
The actual landing was a bit farcical in the sense that we all thought we were going to war, but there was no opposition. So you had 500-600 screaming paratroopers coming off a landing craft onto a beach. Never having done that sort of thing before, was so used to going to war or exercise by parachute that chaos reigned for some little time, where companies had to regroup and go off to do their own individual tasks. So if the landing had been opposed, I think we'd have been in a little bit of trouble in the early stages.
As his troops came ashore, Brigadier Julian Thompson feared an air attack on the ships at anchor in San Carlos. He tried to alert London to the danger, without success.
I was very conscious of the fact that I was responsible for the lives of a large number of men. I sent a letter in which I said, we will, of course, carry out the landing because that's what we've been told to do, but you should know that if we are attacked by the air and the enemy are successful in their attacks, we will take very, very heavy casualties indeed.
Politicians must never show military advisors that they are fearful of too many casualties. Because if you do that, you will put caution on the commanders right down the way when caution probably may not be the right answer.
fast jet pilot, you've got to be good or you're dead. I mean, it doesn't matter which country you come from because they've got to have bloody good reactions, they've got to be good. And the Argentinians, if you imagine, what are they, sort of racing drivers, polo players? I mean, what better sort of chap to have sitting in a fighter?
Yo tenía un radar altímetro graduado a 30 pies.
I set my altimeter at 30 feet, but I must have gone lower than that because the alarm went off several times. We were flying at 450 knots, and at that sort of height, well, it's quite a peculiar experience. I saw the masts of the frigate up ahead, and we lined up for the attack.
They knew what they were doing. They knew how to attack the ship. So they all lined up, one after the other, and came up the stern. At that time, the captain ordered full speed. We tried to manoeuvre to get our 20 millimetres to bear, but it seemed, whichever way the captain turned the ship, there was an aircraft lined up on the stern, ready to come in.
El buque estaba reaccionando bien. El buque había incrementado su velocidad al máximo.
The ship was reacting well. I could see that it was moving at top speed, making for the open waters in the middle of the channel, trying to maneuver away from us. By this time, the ship was directly below me, so I banked over her, dropped the bombs, and escaped. I certainly felt that the skipper below me knew what he was doing. As I flew away, I heard my wingman say, "Well done, sir," which meant that at least one of my bombs had hit target.
De mi numeral, que decía, "Muy bien, señor." Eso me indicaba que de mis bombas algo habían dado bien.
The pilot, Mike Crabtree, just went very silent as we came down over the hill and flew through the smoke. And in the back, we couldn't see what was happening. We could smell the fire smoke. And then we came to the hover off the port quarter and looked out, and it's a sight I shall never forget. The fires of hell burning in that ship. She was at anchor, the gun pointing straight up at the sky, all the hydraulic power gone. The flight deck just smashed in and opened up with a can opener.
I remember waking up again. The dining hall was pitch black. I could see that my hand was injured, but although we had my anti-flash glove on, I could just see a mass of blood around the hand. And though no pain, no feeling at all, I thought, well, they can sew fingers back on these days, no problem. Had a quick feel over the rest of my body. I had a large piece of formica sticking out the top of my head here. I pulled out, threw away. I then tried to get up, and I was unable to. I could get up on all fours, but I was unable to crawl out from whatever it was that was stopping me moving. Dreadful feeling, dreadful.
What did you think about?
Getting out then, getting out. I thought a little cheated at the fact that I'd survived this far. You pray. And I could hear somebody moving around in the debris. And he came up to me and said, "Oh, you're all right, mate, all right." And I said, "Okay, get this thing off my back." I couldn't even see the man, it was so dark. But, I certainly know what I was thinking about those days, that time. My wife was 5 months pregnant at the time with our first child. And I wanted to get home. But like a miracle, the ship must have slewed round, but we got a breath of sweet-tasting air. The hole in the side must have just caught some air and it wafted. And we took a large lungful, and I started moving to the back end of the ship.
I sent them all off, and then I sort of stood there on the bridge on my own, with people getting nearly all my men were off by then. And Yarmouth had put her stern onto our bow because we were sinking by the stern. And I finally walked forward and stepped off onto her. And it was very sad. And as we moved away from her, I know a lot of my chaps were in tears.
Were you?
Yes, I was, yes.
Cuando yo tiro mis bombas, no estoy deseando.
When I bomb a ship, I'm not trying to kill anybody. I certainly wasn't trying to kill the ardent crew. What I'm trying to do is to put the ship out of action, hopefully without causing any casualties. That's how I felt throughout the war, and that's how all my colleagues felt.
Le diría usted entonces ahora si pudiera al Capitán West, ¿no?
Al Capitán West? Bueno.
Captain West? Well, I tell him that I regret sinking his ship, and I'm sorry that some of his men had to die. But I was doing my job just as he was doing his.
Mi tarea, así como él estaba cumpliendo la de él.
Called by HMS Minerva, contact northwest 40 miles. Well, all we saw was one Pucara that was flown by a chap called Major Tomba. And my first run in, I shot at him and shot half his left aileron off and set his right engine on fire. So I was hitting all right, pulled away and thought he would go into the ground. Not a bit of it.
En ese momento miro el ala de mi avión y veo. I looked at my wing and saw a gaping hole. It looked a bit like a rose with open petals. Una rosa con los pétalos abiertos. Miro hacia arriba. Then I saw the two Harriers flying over me. My plane was shaking, but it was still flyable. So I flew on, trying to get away.
Pero si los comandos reaccionaban, los motores funcionaban bien.
Well, this time I came in slower. So I put my flaps down to bring my nose down so I could aim more easily. Noticing the height in my head-up display quite carefully, but tracking nice and smoothly, and fired a long burst into him. Set the port engine on fire, knocked bits off the rear fuselage, and the canopy shattered.
Y siento otra ráfaga. Es decir, el avión sigue vibrando. I felt another burst hitting my fuselage. The plane was still shaking, and then an engine caught fire. I could see I was beginning to lose control. The fire started spreading, and then suddenly I completely lost it. I had to eject. I fell very near the plane, about 40 or 50 meters away.
And I thought, well, what a character. I mean, he should have got out after the first pass. He stayed with it until it just wouldn't fly. Got out just before it hit the ground, and apparently walked back to Goose Green. He was captured later. And I have nothing but the highest respect for him. I mean, that was real bravery.
called the ops room after having shot him down and said, more trade, that means anything else for us to do? And the fellow said, wait. I said, what do you mean, wait? He said, well, actually, we just had our ops room strafed with gunfire, 30mm cannon. The man across the desk from me has lost the top of his head, and I've been hit in the arm, and I'm just collecting myself. And I felt awful. And I said, okay, sorry about that. And within 7 seconds, he was back online saying, right, we think we've got trade for you up to the north.
Argentina's pilots sustained heavy losses. Only a few survived being shot down.
Personalmente pensaba que me iban a tirar al agua. Claro, porque esa era la...
I really thought they were going to throw me overboard. Well, I suppose that when you've just been captured, you tend to be a bit paranoid. They were taking off my survival suit and pointing at me with this rifle. But I also felt this great sense of relief. After all, I was alive.
Right, wrap the black kids around him and let's get him away.
Then I looked down and I noticed that my left leg was at a strange angle. It was dislocated. I was in terrible pain. So they injected me with morphine and painted an M on my forehead.
88, four shallow, but no stronger. Leave that on him for a while. You may have to take. He has got a complete fore and aft dislocation of his left knee, probably rupturing some of his thigh muscle. He had a dislocated left kneecap patella bone, which I've reduced the dislocation. We've now wrapped him up. He's got a nasty lot of bleeding around the joint.
Allí, antes de entrar, pienso que el capitán Hawley también.
They took me to hospital and this doctor told me, here you are just another patient. And the truth is, that's exactly how I felt from then on. Of course, I was in British hands. But I was never really treated like a prisoner. I was just another patient.
Pero no, por el trato.
Although many Argentine planes were shot down, the task force remained vulnerable to air attack. On May the 25th, Atlantic Conveyor was hit by an Exocet missile.
When we drove up, there was a chaplain from the Merchant Seamen's Mission in Manchester, sat in his car on the door, waiting for us on the road. And I saw his little blue badge on his lapel. And I thought, something's wrong. So he said, can I speak to you in the house, please? So I said, yes, come on. So I said to the children, go in the kitchen, please. And sent them away in the kitchen. He took me in the lounge. He said, I'm afraid I have some bad news for you. I said, just how bad? He said, I'm afraid it's the very worst. And then I couldn't get rid of the man. I just wanted him to go. And he said, children, make your mother a strong cup of tea. I can remember that. And they came and they kept saying, what's the matter? I said, shh, be quiet, I'll see you later. And then he went. And then, of course, I told the children.
How did you tell them?
I just said that the ship had been hit and that the dad had been killed. And they sent me a duplicate map saying Frank Folks was buried at sea on Wednesday, the 26th of May. I got a plastic bag and there was his pipe, his wristwatch, his St. Christopher, his wedding ring. I was very upset about them taking his wedding ring off because it worried me. It was very, very tight. He'd never taken it off. And I worried how they'd got it off his fingers. And he always used to wear a cap down below because he didn't like to get oil in his hair. And his cap was in this plastic bag, but they were all wet, still as they'd come out of the sea.
British forces digging in at St. Carlos were held up by the loss of vital equipment on the Atlantic Conveyor. But Julian Thompson was under pressure from London to get on with the war.
At the time, it was clear to me that back in England, there was a political need for a victory so that we could be seen to be doing something, seen to be winning.
I think there were many of us who were worried initially that having got a beachhead at San Carlos, we were going to get stuck there and not be able to break out of it. Because everybody has memories. There were memories of the time it took to break out of the beachhead in Normandy. And in terms of the whole of the Falklands, it wasn't a big area, but just to be stuck in a very small area and confined there would have had all sorts of troubles in every way, not least on the diplomatic front, because if we didn't get a move on, all the proposals for ceasefires would become stronger, and ceasefires which would have conditions which would not have been beneficial from our point of view, all those risks. So a breakout was very important.
Though you are quite happy, or though you don't mind, if you like, dying for your queen and country, you certainly don't contemplate dying for politicians. I was summoned often to the radio telephone to speak with the superior headquarters in Northwood. And on one particular occasion I can remember, after a particularly irritating telephone conversation, walking out of the tent and saying to myself in somewhat of a temper, I shall win the war for these buggers and then I shall go.
On direct orders from London, the 2nd Parachute Battalion launched an attack on the Argentine stronghold at Goose Green.
It's dark. There's an enormous amount of noise. There's incoming fire to you. There's white phosphorus going off to provide smoke and illumination. There's tracer coming towards you and going away from you. There's fear running through you. You close up towards the trenches. You throw grenades. You fire your weapon. You bayonet. It's savage, gutter fighting. Everything you've ever experienced before is nothing like it. It is basic killing.
In command of 2 Para was Lieutenant Colonel H. Jones.
H. Jones was a warrior. He wasn't a peacetime soldier. He was single-minded, he was aggressive, he was determined, charismatic leader. Everybody knew that he was in charge.
The CO got on the radio to A Company and told them to get a grip and speed up and continue the movement, which they couldn't. So he said, I'm not having any of this, and decided to go up and join A Company. To say he got a little bit pear-shaped would be a slight understatement. When he made up his mind that a thing was going to be done, then it was going to be done. You don't actually get time to think. If the CO says you do something, then you do it. You might think bloody fool afterwards or during it, but you get out and do it. And the CO said, we're joining A Company and we're going over the top. So we joined A Company and we went over the top. Once we actually got down there, then we're in a slightly better position. But when I got there, behind the CO, he didn't stop, he kept running. So I thought, here we go. And all of a sudden, somebody behind me shouted out, watch out, there's a trench on the left. And I shouted to him to watch his back, because I could see what was going to happen. And he ignored me, or didn't hear me. I would think he actually ignored me, and charged up the hill to neutralise the trench that I was firing up. As he got to within 6 or 7 feet of that trench, he actually got shot from the trenches behind. You know, that you could actually see, and I saw the round striking the ground behind him, coming up, gradually getting towards him, and actually shot him in the back. And the impact of the rounds hitting him actually pushed him right on top of the trench that he was going for.
The signallers in his headquarters had prepared a phrase, sun rays down. so that I would know that something was wrong with him, which would be the key for me to step in to the breach. And in this confusion, over the radio came this cry, "Sunray is down." And I couldn't believe it. And I actually asked for verification. And Colour Sergeant Blackburn, his signaller, shouted again, "Sunray is down, for Christ's sake." And then the surge of apprehension and fear and would I perform well enough? What do I do now? What's the situation up there? Ran through me.
You know, I was slightly numb in the fact that, you know, COs aren't supposed to die. And the actual implication of the commanding officer taking on an enemy position, frontal, was sort of comic book stuff that you read about and you don't really think that it should happen. I turned him over because he was lying on his back, got his webbing off and actually found the wounds. And at this stage he was still conscious, although slipping into unconsciousness. So I stayed there trying to keep him warm with extra windproofs and his own quilted jacket. And unfortunately, some time later, he died.
Lieutenant Colonel Jones, Captain Wood, Captain Dent, Lieutenant Barry, Corporal Hardman, Corporal Sullivan, Corporal Fryer.
Next to the prisoner of war cage, which was the sheep pens, was actually a pile of ammunition that had to be moved. And we had a rough idea that it was booby-trapped. And we asked the Argentinian officers if they would move the ammunition for their own safety. So they detailed off some men to actually help move the ammunition, which was artillery shells and mortar ammunition. And they were moving it, and all of a sudden there was a bang, and there was a booby trap there. And the soldier involved, right next to the booby trap, was actually in a vacuum, flames and explosives. And the only thing that could be actually done for the soldier, because we couldn't get to him, was actually he was shot to take him out of his misery, because there was nothing humanly else to be done for him. And then I actually thought, I'm lucky. It was an eerie sort of silence, pitch dark, freezing. Then the mind just ran riot, and I felt tears trickling down the side of my face when I thought about good blokes that actually died that day, and the fact that more were likely to die tomorrow, you know, and a lump came in the throat. And I lay there for a good couple of hours, actually going through the events of the day.
In readiness for the advance on Stanley, reinforcements were brought into St. Carlos. To avoid a long march, the Welsh Guards were moved aboard the ship Sir Galahad. It set sail for a place called Bluff Cove. Due to bad weather, the Sir Galahad was diverted away from Bluff Cove into a small inlet called Fitzroy. Major Ewan Southby Taylor was horrified by the ship's arrival. Crammed full of troops in broad daylight, it was in grave danger of Argentine air attack. He wanted the men moved urgently off the ship to the safety of the shore, just 200 yards away.
And I put it to the senior officer that I could find on the stern of the Galahad that my considered and professional opinion as a land aircraft officer and somebody involved in amphibious warfare for almost all my career was that they should get off first and then wait. He was adamant that Bluff Cove was his destination and not Fitzroy. I was equally adamant that I was not going to take him to Bluff Cove in anything in daylight, and I was, of course, tragically proved correct only a few hours later when one of my craft was sunk. I pointed out that it was only 200 yards away. It would take maybe only 20 minutes to get all his men off. He said he wouldn't put his men in a mixed load of ammunition, which we had from Sir Tristram, but we had the boats alongside to take the men off. I explained to him that this is war. We don't operate to peacetime restrictions during war, and that the men were in grave danger. And I think that was probably the most serious and most often made point that I put across. And eventually, in a fit of extreme anger, I told him that he was behaving extremely irresponsibly and that I would not be held responsible for what happened to his men. And of course, tragically, 3 or 4 hours later, I proved absolutely correct.
There was bodies screaming, shouting, and the ship was one big fireball. There was nowhere for the flames to escape. They rebounded and came back and caught most of my back, my legs. And that's where I actually caught fire. And as I was trying to get out, I fell over. That's how I did my hands. It was red hot, the deck, as if the metal had been in a forge in a blacksmith's. To me, it was like as if I was seeing double. There was a hand, and the ripples, the skin off the hands had actually come off to the top here. And it was like a glove on top, and it was flapping about on both hands.
When I came round, I don't know how long, I couldn't have been out that long anyway. So all I could feel was a burning sensation on the lower part of my left leg. So I didn't think nothing of it, so I automatically tried to stand up, not thinking nothing of it. And I remember looking at my left hand because that's what I was more worried about, because it melted. And when I stood up, my leg had gone. There was just little bits left of it.
As I was looking around, you could see other people that were injured, probably your mates, whatever, but you couldn't recognise them because of the blackness of the face, hair burnt. It's gone all black and it started bubbling and sort of scabbing up, and it smelt awful.
I was bleeding from the head, but there was nothing desperately wrong with me. And I knew where the door was, and I started thinking about getting myself out. And
I tried to get up onto my knees, and the thickness of the smoke, which was layered, stopped me breathing straight away, so I had to go back down onto the floor. Unfortunately, I was in somebody else's remains at that time. But I felt it, I couldn't see it. So I started making my way towards the exit, where I knew it was. And a chap from the back of the room, very, very muffled because of the smoke and the darkness, he started screaming that he'd lost his leg. And that was the biggest deciding point in my life, whether or not I was going to go and help him or get out. Nobody would have ever known, because it was just him and me left alive in the room. And I decided I wanted to be a hero. So I went back for him, and we were calling to each other through the darkness. And I was still desperately trying to talk myself into turning around and making my way to the exit. Anyway, I found Kevin Woodford by accident. I must have trodden on the stump of his leg, because the next thing I know, a fist came out of the darkness and clobbered me one. And Kevin was very, very obviously hysterical. I couldn't find my morphine or his morphine. Everything was confused for me. And we carry the morphine around our necks. It's called Omnipon. And he was a big man, and the only thing I could do was to put my arms underneath his arms and start dragging him along the floor in the direction of where I knew the exit was. Well, all the armchairs and settees had turned into barricades, and as he was so heavy and I couldn't lift him and I couldn't breathe as well because of the smoke, I was having to bulldoze my way through the barricades. And I very quickly lost all my strength. I was just losing control completely. And I got him about 3/4 of the way down the room when I whispered to him that I had to leave him and I was going to go and get help.
When the helicopter landed, I was in the stretcher and I was supporting my left leg in the air. And obviously, there was a lot of bits hanging off it, so I suppose it looked very horrific. When they actually got me off the helicopter, I looked around, there was a film crew there, and they seemed to jump at me. So I was a bit annoyed at that. I don't know whether I swore at them or told them to, to go away or whatever. And they were filming me, probably because they'd seen the state of my leg.
Casualties were airlifted to the British hospital ship Uganda. Chris White, suffering from shock and convinced he'd left a man below deck to die, tried to take his own life.
I noticed that they hadn't taken my Omnipon, my morphine ampule off of me, which was affixed to my dog tags around my neck. So I administered the morphine to myself, into my chest, aiming for the heart. And I just moved my shirt over to one side and punched it in. But obviously the needle wasn't deep enough. And I was spaced out for a while. A little while after that, the padre came down. He'd heard about this particular person who kept on trying to do these silly things. And he'd also been talking to a young man up in intensive care who had had his leg taken off by the action on the Galahad. And he put two and two together, and he came down and took me to Kevin Woodford. And I couldn't recognise Kevin because, like I say, when I first met him, it was in the dark. We took one look at each other, burst into tears, and that was it. It's the most incredible feeling.
All the burns victims were treated together in a converted officers' mess on board Uganda.
There was this awful sort of stench of burning. And quite close by to the mess, there was a very tiny galley. And it smelled like somebody had burnt toast. I mean, you just sort of opened the doors, and there was about 40 bears of black faces. And it was a feeling of horror, I suppose, and you just wanted to sort of close the doors and turn away and run. And then you thought, God, you've got to hide this horror you have on your face. And you just walked in and tried to smile and get on with your job. They had very little hair, no eyelashes, no eyebrows. Their hands, at the time, they'd been put into what they call flamazine bags, which are a bag that go over the hand with a special cream that they use for very bad burns. You just wanted to go back to your room and cry your eyes out because you felt so desperately sorry for these people.
I could have got those men off in 20 minutes. No question of that whatsoever. And anybody with any professional sense would have taken the advice of the on-the-spot expert, regardless of rank. But unfortunately, I was not wearing the rank of a lieutenant colonel, who, as far as I can make out, was the only man who was prepared to listen to him. And I think probably in my career that was the most angry I have ever been, although I was not directly involved. It was certainly the only time in my career that I have felt almost shame at being involved in something that has gone wrong. And although I blame myself partly for not insisting with even more vigor that the men were brought ashore, I feel that I am not actually to blame for the deaths of those men. And it gets through to me even now after 6 years, 5 years.
The distance from St. Carlos to Stanley is 60 miles. British troops had to walk the whole way. This yomp was carried out in extremely harsh conditions, freezing temperatures, snow, and driving rain.
Fresh water you couldn't get, so obviously, you take what you can, out of the ground, and we would sort of stamp onto the peat or dig holes until we got a puddle, because it was always sod on the ground. Scoop the water in a mug and put some sterilising tablets in. Now, this water was absolutely black, but I mean, you drank it. No matter how many tabs you use, sterilising tablets, it's going to end up taking it out on you. Now, myself personally, I never had any underpants on by the time we got to Stanley, and there's quite a few guys like that because, having the shits. One of the lads in our troop just undone his zip and just cut through his underpants and just tossed them away and just carried on walking. I mean, there was nothing else he could do. I mean, the doc, he just said, the only thing you can do, because you're losing body fluid, is to just drink lots of water. Of course, we're drinking that crap again.
As the British troops closed in, the Argentine conscripts could only wait. Dug in on the mountains around Stanley, they prepared for the final battles.
In
those last days, all we talked about was how many would die. 5, 10, 20. We felt this impotence. We were waiting for death, and there was nothing we could do about it. So you looked back at what you'd done in your life. But we were 19, so there's not much we could have done, really.
For the British, too, there was an anxious wait. Troops had to sit it out until the order to attack was given.
Nothing happened.
and the tension was pretty sort of electric, and we were all moving in extended line, and still nothing happened, and we were just waiting. And after a while, you know, you could almost feel a sense of relief. People were beginning to think, well, they've bugged out, they're not here anymore. And just as we were beginning to feel that, there was suddenly, literally, the horizon just lit up in a complete sort of sea of white flashes. That initial firefight was quite incredible. It was like being at the wrong end of a machine gun range. And the noise was incredible. And I think we were fairly stunned for a minute or two. And you really had the feeling that if you raised your hand, you know, slightly in the air, it would be shot off.
Y cayó una granada y le pegó al pibe este y lo levantó en el aire.
A grenade exploded near us and lifted the soldier up in the air. There was shouting and screaming and explosions and bullets flying. Complete chaos. Anyway, he stood up and shouted, "I'm hit, I'm hit."
Me hirieron, me hirieron.
He was swearing and screaming at the top of his voice, but he could still walk. He turned to me and said, "Here, take my rifle." He handed over his ammunition to another soldier, and then he started shouting, "I'm leaving, I'm leaving." I suppose he meant it was over for him, that he'd had enough. This was all happening with the British troops right in front of us, very close by. It was all so crazy. It's hard to explain now. Anyway, he started walking away and they threw a phosphorus grenade at him. And he actually caught fire and started screaming. He was like a human torch, but what really bothered us was that he was lighting up our positions so that the enemy could see us. So we started waving him away. At that point, we didn't care whether he lived or died.
Well, you can always tell if you're close to someone when they've been hit, because you hear the crack of the bullet, but you also hear a sort of horrible sort of thwack as the bullet hits sort of solid flesh and bone, and it's pretty unpleasant. It's an extraordinary noise, I suppose. Very grim, and you just, even if you've never heard that sort of thing before, you just instinctively know exactly what's happened. And one of my soldiers who had a night sight suddenly saw one of them. And we heard the crack, and we heard the thump as it hit the Argentinian. There was a moment's silence, and then there was most terrible screaming from this Argentinian. And he was screaming for his mother. And there was complete silence from both sides at this point, and both of us listened to it. And I'm sure we, in a way, were just as horrified as the Argentinians. It really was an awful noise. And it went on and on and on.
Terminé de cargar y me levanté. Y cuando me levanté, tenía un tipo...
I finished loading, and when I stood up, there was a British soldier right in front of me. By this time, they were all over us. And then he shot me. He shot me in the head. I felt as though I was falling backwards in slow motion. They must have thought I was dead. They just left me there. But in fact, the bullet hadn't hit the skull. It ran down my helmet and hit me in the back of the neck. And I thought, my God, I'm alive. I turned around, I don't know how, and started crawling back on all fours. I tried to stand up, but I couldn't. I reached the edge of the mountain, and I remember seeing the whole valley beneath me. It was like a vision of hell. The most terrifying sight I've ever seen. Explosions, fires, machine guns rattling, soldiers yelling and screaming. An inferno. I felt everything spinning around me. And when I tried to stand up, I fell down the slope.
Y cuando me paré, me caí. A mí ya me daban por muerto. Cuando me llevaron acá...
They all thought I was dead. I was conscious, but I just couldn't move a single muscle. So they rolled me up in this blanket and put me on top of this pile of bodies. Later, a sergeant came along, jotting down the names of the dead soldiers. He was crying. He looked desperate. Well, it was such complete chaos, and he started talking to me, and I must have blinked, because suddenly he realized that I was still alive.
As we started going up the mountain and the enemy were just melting before us, we just went faster and faster until we got to the top. And in a way, we almost couldn't believe that we'd got to the top. And there, just 4 kilometers away or something, and clearly in view, was Stanley. We could see the lights, and I think for a second or two, we just sort of stood there looking at this with euphoria that, you know, we'd done it. And of course, that was fatal, because at that moment, from 200 meters away, an Argentinian automatic weapon of some sort and several other weapons opened up on us. And in that initial sort of burst, which was almost a sort of ambush, really, 3 of us were hit. I saw the person in front of me just spin round, sort of pirouette round. He'd been hit in the hand, and the force just sort of literally knocked him spinning like a top. And there was a crack behind me, and someone had been hit behind me. And it all seemed to be in slow motion. In fact, it was just my brain thinking rather faster. But as I turned to run into the nearest cover myself, I suddenly felt something like enormous sort of hammer blows on my legs. And the tracer from the rounds was like sort of, you know, sort of scarlet rods all around me. And I noticed that my right leg especially, both my legs, but especially my right leg, was very sort of stiff already. And there was a sort of brief burning sensation through the muscle on my right arm. I put my right hand down to touch my leg, and 2 of my fingers went in up to the knuckles. And it was at that point that I realized I had actually been hit. The stretcher bearers found it very difficult to get into us. Eventually they did, and they started carrying us down. And then the next thing I knew was that I was lying a short distance from my stretcher, and there was complete silence. I never heard the blast or anything. Whether I'd been knocked unconscious for a short time, I don't know. I turned round, and the stretcher bearers basically were in pieces. At least one of them was completely blown to pieces. It really was wretched. I just couldn't believe it.
As the British moved on towards Stanley, Argentine dead were left scattered across the battlefield. Burying them was a gruesome task.
The first guy I came across, he had all of this part of his face here was totally missing, and he had upper chest wound. And I took his dog tags out, and while I was doing it, I was talking all the time. I was going, okay, right, I'm just going to undo his dog tags, and right, yeah, here they come, yeah. Not because I was trying to tell the lads what I was doing, obviously I was just trying to stop myself from thinking about this guy. Because, you know, you'd find a wallet on him, and there'd be a picture in there of them with their wife and kids. And I was looking at it and I thought, well, you know, fucking hell, you know, that could have been me lying there. Everybody we came across was all twisted. You could see the agony, you know, that these guys had been in when they died. I mean, their legs were all twisted, their arms. And then we found an Argentine officer. He'd been injured, he had a belly wound. I can't remember who found him. And they called me over, said, oh, come on over here, Lou, and have a look at this guy here, and went over. And he was sort of, he started speaking to me in English. And he was telling me, you know, that he didn't know why he was, you know, why we were fighting either. I feel bad about the bodies. you know, the state of them and everything. And, you know, the way we sort of just toss them into a hole. Yeah, they were just kids. The guy that was injured, you know, I wish that he'd never spoken English, like, you know, and he died. Can we stop a minute? It took me 4 years to cry about a few dead people. Because obviously you can't cry then. You know, you got a job to do and you do it. I still feel, even now I feel, you know, why am I crying? Or what? I'm afraid I just don't see him as enemy, you know.
Entonces hay una toma de conciencia de que ya
we realized that it was pointless to carry on. We had no more cards to play.
reducida apenas a 10 o 12 piezas.
Our artillery was down to about 10 or 12 guns.
Apoyo aéreo directo.
We had no air support.
Los ingleses
The
mantenían
British were just off our shores, shelling us.
para reforzar sus propios fuegos.
Our men were exhausted. They had fought hard and had lost much of their equipment. If we'd carried on, we would have just have been wasting lives.
De más vidas, que era inútil.
That is the conclusion I reached.
Esa fue la conclusión.
So then I discussed it with the High Command before accepting the British offer of a ceasefire and the start of negotiations.
Resolví aceptar el cese del fuego ofrecido por los ingleses y más tarde se produjeron las conversaciones correspondientes.
Yo sentía una congoja muy grande. Para mí era...
It really hurt. We had been defeated and I felt defeated. What really stuck in my mind was seeing the Union Jack flying after the surrender. That was quite a blow. I was so angry and frustrated that I broke down in tears. I remember thinking about all I had been through. The hunger and the cold, loneliness, and the death of so many of my friends. And after all that, there was the British flag flying over us. It was unbearable.
as I walked around the corner and actually Stanley came into view, I thought, bloody hell, was it all worth it? It was smelly, dirty, and it just wasn't my idea of what Stanley was going to be.
The whole place was chaotic, with guns and ammunition lying about, the odd dead body. Every other building seemed to have a red cross on it, and there was the smell, which is unmistakable, of death. And we eventually went to the top floor of a little house which we requisitioned, which we shared with one of the companies of 2 Para. And during the night, we turned on one of our radios to the BBC World Service, and we heard about the surrender from the BBC 8,000 miles away, which was being conducted in a building 800 yards from where I was sitting. And we all felt the most enormous sense of relief. And my main feeling was that no more young men were going to have to die. It was not like winning a football match or anything like that. It was just an enormous sense of relief that it was over, we could all go home.
We sailed in early that morning. Everywhere that you looked was small boats packed with people to cheer us in. And it was a brilliant feeling, really, because, you know, it did make it then seem worthwhile.
Just upset you. You felt very bitter towards the people that were coming back, not as individuals, just because they'd all come back and Frank hadn't.
Great, wonderful, you're wonderful.
Though on the surface there seemed to be a lot of razzmatazz, the homecoming in many aspects was fairly subdued as a personal experience for many of us. There was a feeling that we didn't want to leave the environment in which we had spent so long among our own comrades, amongst our friends, people we knew, and go into a world which was full of people who didn't know what we'd gone through, who were perhaps putting the wrong connotation on what had happened, who were perhaps reveling in the fact of victory for the wrong reasons. And I actually, in some ways, felt somewhat reluctant to walk down the brow of that ship in amongst it all.
Returning to Buenos Aires, conscripts found that life seemed to go on much the same as before the war.
Entonces fuimos a un boliche, como le decimos nosotros, a una boate.
I remember we went out to this bar and I walked in and I thought, well, this can't be a very happy place after all that's been going on. I went up to the bar and I ordered a beer. And I looked around me and the place was full of happy faces. Everyone was having a good time, celebrating as though we'd just won the World Cup. You'd think that nothing had happened in Argentina.
No había nada, no había pasado nada. Acá en la Argentina nunca pasó nada. Entonces uno se pregunta.
And I asked myself, how many fathers did I kill? What was the point? Did I do all this for my country? What's my country? Are you my country? All those of you laughing and dancing and having a good time while we suffer? It's not resentment. I'm not asking for any reward. All I'm saying is, look, we risked our lives at 19. Many didn't come back. But we did. What are we supposed to do now?
Nosotros estamos acá y ahora qué hacemos.
I asked to go down to South Sea and drive along the seafront before we finally returned to our home. And as I drove along the front there, people were having their summer holidays. They were eating their ice creams, they were sitting in their deck chairs, and they were generally passing the time of life, the time of day, enjoying themselves. And I felt as if I wanted to pick them up and shake them and say, look, there is a war going on. People are getting killed. And somehow I felt for them that the war was something that happened at 8 o'clock in the morning when they picked up their newspapers or switched on the radio, or at 9 o'clock at night when the TV news came on.
I didn't go home for the first sort of few days. I didn't like all the flag waving. Strangers would come up and say something stupid like, did you kill anybody, you know? Or they'd be slapping you on the back and buying you pints, and you'd go along with it a bit, yeah, I was down there and all that lot. But you never really tell them what it was like, you just tell them, well, basically what, as much as the British public do know.
I don't think there are any best moments. The whole affair is one of tragedy. War is a messy, dirty, miserable business. And we should never, ever allow ourselves to go to war.
We, the British people, are proud of what has been done. Proud of these heroic pages in our island story. Proud to be here today to salute the task force. Proud to be British.
We went to fight because they had invaded British territory. And it's really all a question of pride. And I think Britain had to have that pride in herself. Or as a nation, we would have just been, what now? They had to do it. Oh, the price that my family paid. No one will ever know exactly what price we paid. Perhaps it was worth it for Britain's sake.